Good evening and welcome to The Report with me, Jonathan Steele. The British government is convinced that the country is under severe threat of a terrorist attack and has raised the terror threat from substantial to severe. The government also wants extra powers to fight the threat, including the ability to confiscate the passports of suspected terrorists at UK borders. Yasmin Khatun has more on this story.
Yesterday, the British government outlined plans to toughen up existing counter-terrorism laws as UK security forces say the deteriorating situation in Iraq and Syria has increased the risk of a terrorist attack at home. According to the Home Office, we are now under severe threat of a terrorist attack. The terror threat was raised from substantial to severe on Friday, as Prime Minister David Cameron set out his plans to overhaul existing counter-terrorism measures. This comes in light of the ongoing search for the suspected British-born Islamic State killer of American journalist James Foley.
Think about what you are doing. Think about the lives you destroy, including those of your own family.
Under the plans, police will be given temporary powers to seize passports at UK borders of anyone they suspect is travelling abroad to fight. British nationals suspected of engaging in any activity abroad could be prevented from returning to the country. In addition, airlines will be legally required to hand over passenger lists to help identify jihadists. Labour leader Ed Miliband welcomed the proposed new powers and pledged that his party would work with the new government to defeat their definition of extremism. It is thought that about 500 British nationals are believed to have travelled to Iraq and Syria to fight on behalf of Islamic State and other groups. The measures have attracted widespread criticism from civil liberties campaigners and Muslim groups.
While the measures that are being implemented have a finite, limited scope, because the ideas that they're built upon are completely ambiguous, they can end up affecting anybody and everybody. So I, for example, anticipate immediately getting stopped and questioned and hassled and harassed for no good reason, simply because there's absolutely no clear definition that marks out somebody who may be a genuine risk or a threat from somebody who's just a practicing Muslim. Once the legal system starts to get compromised in this way, you do eventually end up in a situation where, and we've had cases like this before, covered in the media, where people who aren't the initial target in the minds of the people who make these proposals end up being affected by it.
Concerns have also been raised over the impact this may have on charities and the relief work that is being carried out. Adhering to British values is not an option or a choice. These are the words of our Prime Minister David Cameron. But draconian measures coming into practice targeting specific groups, does any semblance of choice remain? Yasmin Khatun, The Report, Islam Channel.
Well, with me to discuss some of what we saw in that report is Cerie Bullivant, media officer at the advocacy organisation CAGE, journalist and author Victoria Brittain, and on Skype we're joined by Mohammed Amin, who is the chairman of the Conservative Muslim Forum. Welcome to you all. Let me begin with you, Cerie. I mean, these 500 people who've apparently gone over to Iraq and Syria, they're obviously a threat in Iraq and Syria. In what way do you think they are a threat? Are they a threat in Britain?
There are two aspects here to that question. Firstly, from everything that we're hearing from the people that have gone out to Iraq and Syria, none of them seem to have the intention to return home anyway. If you see the messages that they're putting out, their intention seems to be to do whatever they want to do in Syria and Iraq, either defeat Assad or, if in the case of ISIS, establish an Islamic State, or die trying. So they're not talking about returning home. This isn't something that seems to be on their mind. The second aspect, which is very important, is that if you look at all of the terror plots that have been foiled in the UK, they were carried out by a total of 66 people. Out of these 66 people that have actually physically attempted to do some sort of terrorism in the UK, only 2 of them had battleground experience. So there's no empirical evidence that people coming out of a war zone pose a threat directly to the UK. The majority of people who have actually tried to do things have never been on a battlefield, have never been in those sorts of situations.
Well, Victoria Brittain, I mean, this threat that the government talks about, I mean, do you think this is partly pre-election politicking to get people excited?
Well, it could be partly that, and I think it's partly to do with the threat of UKIP for the Conservatives. But I completely agree with Kerry. For a start, we don't know that there are 500 people. It's just this figure has been put around. And the young people that we see often on social media of one sort or another, or who've given interviews to various TV channels, are exactly what he says. They're people who say, I no longer want to live in Britain. I think this is much better what I'm doing. This is my life. So I think that the idea that somehow they pose a threat to us is hugely overblown. And I think it's very dangerous that we whip up this kind of hysteria, partly because I think the effect that it has on all of us is very bad. Secondly, the effect that it has on the Muslim community is, of course, to make people very paranoid. And if you put that alongside with some of the measures that are being suggested, and I'll just mention the idea of changing what used to be control orders and are now TPIMs, bringing those back in again, I think is an extremely bad idea. I spent almost 10 years working with families who were on control orders. And the effects on family life, the whole family was under house arrest, not just the husband suspected. And I think that all the psychiatrists or doctors or social workers who dealt with that regime thought that it was disastrous for the development of the people.
Well, let me come on to Mohammed Amin, who's on the phone, not on Skype, as I said at the beginning. I mean, do you think there really is a threat from these, let's say, 500 people, if it is that, who've gone to Iraq and Syria, Mohammed?
Let's be under no illusions. The threat is real. Earlier this year, there was a serious fatal shooting in Brussels at a Jewish museum. I can't remember whether it was 2 or 4 people that were killed. And the man who's been arrested for that shooting, I understand, is a man who's had combat experience overseas. So when people go to a battle zone, they learn how to fight, they learn how to kill. If they're highly motivated by a terrorist ideology, they represent a serious risk if they're back in the UK.
But we've just heard from Kerry that only 2 out of the 66 people had any battle training at all. So, I mean, surely we're risking all our civil liberties for the sake of a very minimal increase in threat.
What Kerry is talking about is a previous collection of terrorists in different circumstances when the same kind of conflict was not going on. I am worried about the people who are out there right now killing people on behalf of ISIS. What kind of attitudes will they bring back with them when they come back to the UK?
Do you agree, then, that passports can be taken away? I mean, isn't that against international law?
Well, let's start at the beginning. Can we agree that there's a problem before we go on to the question of what the solutions are?
Well, you've said there's a problem, so you go on.
The question of what to do about it, of course, is difficult and challenging because we have to operate within the law. We cannot make British citizens stateless. So the simple idea of saying that somebody's in Iraq, we're not going to let them back, doesn't wash, and that isn't what the government is trying to do. The government is looking for legal ways to control how they come back to the UK, maybe additional interrogation, maybe TPIMs when they do come back to the UK. Whatever we do has to comply with the law, otherwise judges will strike it down. But be under no illusion about the seriousness of the threat.
Well, Kerry, how do you feel about the fact that the Labour Party, as we saw in that clip, Ed Miliband, seems to support whatever the government is going to do?
Well, one of the problems that we've got with our current system is that all of the parties agree broadly with this push. Labour Party are just upset that the control orders were dismantled in the first place, even though the rebranded version, which is the TPIMs, are almost identical. Liberty did an analysis and said that the majority of the wording in both pieces of legislation is exactly the same. One of the small differences that was between TPIMs and control orders was this relocation issue, and even that they want to bring back in. And it's to be honest, horrific that the government wants to bring in such racist legislation that is only used against Muslims. And it's sad that we have people like the guest on the phone who give legitimacy to that with this yes sir, no sir mentality of buying into these things. He said that the sample group was taken from a different time. That sample group was taken from post 9/11. Since post 9/11, we've constantly been at war in one country or another with British combatants in those countries. Iraq, getting rid of Saddam, and Afghanistan fighting with the Taliban. So during that whole region where this test sample was brought, there was plenty of opportunity for people to go out and fight and come back. So the test sample is in exactly a similar situation to now. And the points that the guest made, I feel, really don't stand up to any scrutiny.
Well, Victoria, I mean, do you think there should be some sort of counter-terrorism activity going on, and if so, how should it be done?
Well, I mean, there is constant counter-terrorism going on, and we have a very sophisticated system with very highly trained people working on this issue. But the idea of tightening that up and putting more resources, and as I said before, getting the population afraid about it, I think is very bad. But if you think, I just want to take up the point about you can't make people stateless. We have actually done that. The British government has taken away 3 passports from British Somalis, or British Egyptian in one case, in Somalia. 2 of those people were killed by American forces on the basis of information given by Britain. And the 3rd is now in solitary confinement awaiting trial in the United States. Now, these are 3 kids from North London. They were 3 young boys who had spent years being harassed, stopped under Schedule 7, having their houses visited, being told to assist the police and the security services with spying on their fellows. And in the end, they were sort of hounded out of our country, and we then took away their passports and in 2 cases killed them. We're already in a very, very dangerous mentality that people are expendable. The idea to me, sorry, just to finish on this, that 3 lads from Kentish Town can be important enough for the Commander-in-Chief of the American forces, and possibly Obama himself, who oversees drone killings, could have spent time thinking that these boys should, in 2 cases, be killed, and in another case, arrested and taken to America. Just shows that we are out of control here.
Well, let's put that point to Mohammed Amin. Out of control here, Victoria Brittain says, Mohammed, I mean, why do you think that there needs to be a tightening up when we have these draconian surveillance techniques and other things going on already?
Let's go back, first of all, to the case of the 3 people that have been mentioned. I don't have the details about their circumstances. I don't know what the intelligence agencies had on them, and neither does Victoria Brittain. So it's very difficult to actually decide whether that was an appropriate course of action or not an appropriate course of action.
Well, all right, but deal with the other point of why it's necessary to tighten up laws and practices, procedures, which are already very, very tight.
Because when we come back to TFIMs, for example, they are not working well enough. This morning on Radio 4, we had David Anderson, the Independent Review of Terrorism Legislation, who agrees that there is a need for some small changes to the TPIM rules, which at the moment don't work effectively enough. And one of them is this question about where people live.
Well, some small changes may be necessary, but why does that justify calling the threat level severe?
The threat level is assessed by the intelligence agencies based upon what they know about the dangers, what they know about people who may be planning things. You and I are not privy to the intelligence, neither of us. I am personally seriously worried about the number of British citizens fighting for ISIS. And these are people who are dangerous in Iraq, and they'll be dangerous when they come back here.
Well, Kerry, that's exactly the point that you dispute, isn't it?
I'd like to sort of talk about this idea that the intelligence services know all of these things that we don't know. The intelligence services have misled us and got it wrong with Iraq and weapons of mass destruction. The intelligence services were completely blindsided by 7/7. The intelligence services aren't some sort of infallible organisation that aren't going to make any mistakes. And it's worth mentioning that British Muslims are being told at the moment by the Conservatives, who this man supports, that we need to accept British values. Let me tell you what Lord Macdonald said about relocation orders and the element that David Cameron wants to bring back. He said that forced relocation is a form of internal exile that is completely inimical to British traditions and norms. He said that they're disproportionate and that the review was completely right they're unjustified and disproportionate, and the review was completely right to suggest that they should be repealed. Now, the Conservative Party and your guest here is telling us that these relocation things are a good measure that we should bring in. How about the Conservative Party and take a sky blue look at this, stop rehashing old policies that haven't worked, that have destroyed families, stop rehashing the past, and come up with something new for once?
Well, I think on that note we'll have to end. I'm sorry, Mohammed Amin, you can't reply to that particular point. We've run out of time. We must take the first break of the evening now, but do join us in part 2 when we'll be looking at the rest of the day's news.